Hello, everyone. Lindsay Horvath, your mayor here, wanting to welcome you to One City, One Pride and our annual Pride celebration. On behalf of all of my colleagues, we want to wish you a very happy Pride. We know that Pride in West Hollywood is 365 days a year, but today and all this month, we honor you in a very special way. Thank you for being the best part of West Hollywood.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Lauren Meister. Welcome to the City of West Hollywood's One City, One Pride LGBTQ Arts Festival. Each year, the City of West Hollywood celebrates Pride with its One City, One Pride Arts Festival, which runs from Harvey Milk Day through the end of June Pride Month. 41 days of Pride, but we all know it's actually 365 days of Pride in the City of West Hollywood. This year, we need to do this virtually, but we have a great program in store, so thanks for coming, and again, happy Pride.
Hello, everyone. Councilmember John Erickson here, and I want to welcome you to 2021's One City, One Pride LGBTQ Arts Festival event. I'm so excited that you are here, and I want to extend my sincere thanks to all of the staff, all of the amazing artists that are participating throughout the month, and especially to all of you who are going to be tuning in to all of these great programs. Thank you for helping us celebrate Pride, but most importantly, thank you for being part of our amazing LGBTQ community. Happy Pride, everyone, and enjoy the show.
Hi, my name is Councilmember Sethi Shine, and I just want to welcome you to the City of West Hollywood's One City, One Pride LGBTQ Arts Festival and Programming. And Chloe, the Queen of Weo, and I just want to say Happy Pride!
Hi, my name is Mike Che, Arts Coordinator for the City of West Hollywood. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a great One City, One Pride planned for you this year with about 20 free events, exhibits, and programs for you to enjoy. You can check out all the listings at weho.org/pride. Enjoy the show and happy Pride.
Thank you all for being here. This is a program sponsored by Prism Comics and supported by a grant from the City of West Hollywood's Arts Division as part of the city's One City, One Pride LGBTQ Arts Festival. And it's a panel on queer historical comics. I'm really excited about talking with everyone here because these are some of my favorite creators and they're also super queer. So that's awesome. So maybe I think that we'll begin this with having everyone introduce themselves and what they're working on, historical comics that they're working on. So let's start off with Ajuan.
Hi, my name is Ajuan Mance, and I'm an artist, an illustrator, and a comic creator. I created a comic series called Gender Studies that tracks my adventures as a Black genderqueer nerd. And I also do a lot of single comics for various anthologies. And we'll be producing a graphic novel in the coming, it should emerge in early 2022.
Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Orner. I'm a cartoonist and a storyboard artist. I have a new book coming out from Henry Holt, Metropolitan Books. It's a biography of the LGBTQ pioneer and former Congressman Barney Frank. And it's coming out in October.
Thank you. Josh, you're next on my grid.
Sure. I'm Josh Trujillo. I'm a writer and comic book creator based out of LA. I've done a lot of historical nonfiction comics for the nib.com. And I have a book from Abrams coming out in 2022 or 2023 about George Washington's gay general, von Steuben.
I was wondering how to pronounce that. It's Steuben, huh?
There's actually two pronunciations and they're both right.
Okay. And Melanie, you're next on my grid.
Hi, my name is Melanie Gillman, and I am a graphic novelist. The book that I made is called Stage Dreams, and this is a lesbian Western romance about stagecoach robbers causing havoc and also smooching in 1861 New Mexico. It's a whole lot of fun.
That is such a fantastic log line. I love that. And AC. Last but not least.
Yeah, so I'm AC Esguerra. I'm also an LA-based comics artist and illustrator. My debut graphic novel, 80 Days, is about queer 1930s pilots, and it comes out with Archaea later this year.
Excellent, thank you all. It feels like a moment right now. There's a sort of zeitgeist for queer history and queer historical narratives. Seeing them on television, in film, and comics are no exception. And it feels like there's a lot of stuff happening right here. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about your own relationship to history, or potential interest in history. Did you always gravitate towards historical tales? Do you always find it these sorts of things inspirational? Were you frustrated with history? What's your sort of relationship with historical narratives in general?
I'll start us off. I love history. I sort of live and breathe it. I'm a real history nerd, and I grew up in that sort of household. My mother was a history teacher. And I've also, at times where drawing wasn't providing me with enough income, I've worked in politics, which is sort of history adjacent. And I think that I've thought a lot about this. Why sort of an explosion of narrative, sometime in comic form, sometime in some other art form, about historical figures. And I think it's sort of a staid field. I think it took a while to catch up with us. And now that it has, there's this wealth of material that's sort of unplowed, anyway, that's my first thought. And I'm thinking, I'm like looking at a book that I don't have this on my, it's not here as a prop, but I like Hilary Mantel, not that she has gay characters, but fictionalizing history is sort of, I think, having a little bit of a renaissance. She's part of it, not responsible for it, but and it's nice to be a part of that.
Yeah. Ajuan, you're a professor as well of African American literature, so you're dealing, I'm sure, when you're teaching these texts, you're dealing with history and trying to create historical context for these narratives all the time anyway, in your sort of day job, as well as the day job of comics.
That's true. I am a professor by day, and I have two books that are literary histories, and so that's my other life. And I think it, at least in terms of, I think, marginalized identities in particular, queer identities, trans identities, Black identities, having a sense of the history, having a sense of those who've been walking the path, even with different nomenclature before, I'm using my professor words, before then, really help ground us in a sense of entitlement to our own lives and our own freedom, and to continue to walk that path. And so, it's been integral to my own development of my identity, but also, the stories that have been super empowering to me, I want to share with others.
So finding sort of inspiration in those stories. Josh, you actually have, and I want to get back to this when we start discussing the work itself, but you use a meta narrative in your the Washington's Gay General story, where you're really talking about yourself as a sort of modern gay man, being inspired by these tales of queerness from the past. Do you always look to historical narratives for that sort of thing, for that inspiration for your own work and for your own?
I would say a big driver of my interest in nonfiction and history. Like, I'm a journalism kid, kind of, but also I've just been looking for myself in history, and I think that's what we do when we're kind of looking for stories, kind of these minority groups. And I just think there's such an appetite for it. You know, we've had a really empowering kind of maybe 20 years or even longer for kind of like queer rights and just expanding our understanding of each other and ourselves. And I think that's what is really driving. We want to find ourselves in the past too, because there's so many great examples of that.
And Melanie, AC, whoever wants to jump in, like, I mean, you're both also finding characters in the past to be inspired by, to help readers potentially. How do you view this?
Okay. I mean, I'm writing about an alternate 1930s timeline, and like I was inspired by reading a lot of pilot autobiographies of pilots from that like golden age of flight time, and it's so inspiring. It's so beautiful, the way that they talk about the romanticism and the practicality of flight, taking like a long view of human nature, etc. But always there's a point in the book where they will either travel through the Middle East or Africa, sometimes Asia, and it'll become so racist and so disappointing for me. And so for me, I wanted to tell that kind of story without feeling limited to the existing canon of like relegating brown and queer people to like these secondary or these roles that are just meant to like demonstrate some kind of imperialist moral, like I don't want to say like I wanted to just correct anything with my work. I want my work to be beautiful on its own, but definitely there's like that frustration that you were talking about. I like felt that. Make the beauty out of the frustration. Yeah.
One of the things that was a big driver for me was kind of a apologize for swearing, kind of a fuck you to the way that the historical record has deliberately tried in so many ways to bury so much of queer history, that, as a queer person looking back on our own history, and whether we are, writing nonfiction or taking historical documents and then translating them into fiction, one of the things that we're doing is we're kind of like staking a claim in the timeline of like, no, like this happened and we have been here and these are the stories of our predecessors, and this is, kind of unburying something which for a very long time there's been an active campaign to try to disappear from the historical record. So there was something really empowering for me. I think especially, growing up in a time period where so much of queer history was kind of, not talked about in school, not something that people really acknowledged as being a thing. So being able to go back into the historical record and look for stories, look for documentation, and uncover what we can, and then try to bring some of that back into, modern publishing, modern books, and put it into, libraries in the hands of readers today. There's something that I found really empowering about that. And it's a task that I think is important for us. The more that we're able to do this as a community of queer authors, the more that we're able to, kind of increase the amount of documentation that's still going to be available to, the generations that are going to come after us. So thinking about in the broad sense of the timeline, both, before us and after us, the work that we're doing, I find very important for our overall place within history.
Yeah, that's really important. And to I'm curious though, like you're saying kind of drawing inspiration from these historical figures, and then all of you have sort of approached then what to do next differently, because Melanie, you then created historical fiction, whereas Josh, for example, went for a specific telling the story of a specific person within history. So I wonder if you all could, and whoever wants to jump in here, the difference between, and then AC also creating a sort of alternate timeline, sort of actually leaning into ideas of genre to still portray this history, but come at it from an even more sort of imaginative viewpoint. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about how, what you did next. Like how do you decide what kind of narrative to put forward, whether it be historical fiction, historical narrative, or genre, historically based genre work?
Can I cut in here? I misspoke before. I said fictionalizing history, and I should have said dramatized it.
Yeah.
But I find certainly in the last 3 years writing my book about Barney that those lines get very blurry the minute you start adding pictures. I worked with him a lot early on. About 3 years ago, I stopped wanting to take his phone calls because I didn't want him to tell me anything that meant I was going to have to undo 20, freshly inked panels. But it's one thing to know what was said in the conversation. It's another thing to know what the decor looked like, or even where it was. He would relate something that happened to him 45 years ago, and he would have the vaguest notion of it. It was in the Boston Common. The Boston Common's big, and and who he spoke to, he had forgotten the features of that person. So you're making stuff up, even when you're basically cleaving to nonfiction. You're making stuff up. And I found, to my relief somewhat, that in this day and age, there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of, based on a true story. That's an old phrase, but you see variations of that in a lot of very, popular entertainment, like things on Netflix. But can I just, and then I'll shut up. One thing that Melanie said that made me I feel like I'm living it right now. She was talking about unburying the past to reveal something that hadn't been talked about. I live in New York City. We go up north to the Adirondacks every weekend. I'm a history buff. My partner is not, and so I have enough trouble, getting to stop at Franklin Roosevelt's house in Hyde Park or the big historical sites. I sail by a Baron von Steuben memorial, sort of out there in a giant field hard by the interstate in the Mohawk Valley, who I guess is the subject of Josh's new work. And I had I drive by that thing every day. I'm not every day, but every week in the summer, and had no idea that there was a gay story there. And that's, literally in my backyard. So
they're everywhere.
So I was getting, and I like history. I stop at monuments, but that's one I never even considered. And now I can't wait to drag them out there. So anyway.
Any other thoughts from any of you on why historical narrative versus historical fiction versus genre fiction with historical elements? Like why you decided to the decision you made?
Yeah, for the von Steuben book, his life is incredibly well documented. Pretty much you could spend a lifetime reading about the Revolutionary War and only get a fraction of it. But because of either omission or intentional destruction of letters, or who knows what, the gay part of his life has been largely untold. And so it's been really like a breath of fresh air for me to kind of find a new context to look at a lot of these historical events. And that's been why I've been interested in presenting it as a nonfiction narrative. Whereas I think there's a lot of value in kind of presenting these eras and kind of reclaiming them for peoples who maybe didn't have that visibility or didn't have that identity at the time.
Yeah, I mean, taking the view of, coming at this from a, alternate, like almost more like, if we're going to talk genre, like science fiction / fantasy oriented angle. I mean, really, for me, it was just kind of preference. That's just sort of like, I was drawn to the aesthetic of this time period always. And it's also sort of a way of going against expectations. I've had people say before, oh, so if you're writing about like, world wars or whatever, why aren't you writing about the Pacific theater, since you're Asian? And it's like, I feel like that's important to explore, but that's not necessarily what inspires me, So coming at it from an alternate way was a way to, similar to what Josh said, like contextualize, but also reclaim. Yeah.
And allow yourself more freedom in a sense. I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, and also to, I'm queering the golden age of flight. I'm queering like film noir, and these are, images that are very powerful in our culture, but are always usually very white. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know. I was like, why?
Yeah, I mean, your book is extraordinarily beautiful. So I'm thrilled that you're taking that sort of imagery and making it your own. Anyone else sort of reacting to this? How you decided what sort of genre to work in?
I will say there is a project that's kind of in scattered pieces that I'm working on, and I've worked on it in terms of illustrations, also in terms of comics. And it addresses this issue, it fictionalizes African-American historical figures from the past who wouldn't have known each other, but who would likely be friends today, and imagines what they would do in our world, which is, kind of rooted in history. These are real people based on what I know about them, doing a little research on them. But I think it really kind of, for me, it shows my hand in that my interest in history is in many ways very selfish. There are things that I need from my historical forebears. There are questions I wish they had been asked when they were alive, but at the time they were not considered to be important enough to have interviews and books written about them. Other people were, these folks were not. And so I am taking it upon myself to do that for myself and for the rest of us, also to bring these folks alive and try to repatriate Black histories, and particularly Black queer histories, to those of us who have lost them. And the histories are usable to us, whether the figures are deployed in the interests of our own questions, our personal questions today. But I think this really makes the history a little bit more accessible, and it is fiction. At the same time, it lets these folks kind of inhabit our worlds and our memories.
I also found that with my own work, there was kind of a inverse relationship between the amount of actual historical documentation that was available and how feasible it would be to write like straight up nonfiction. Like for, writing about queer histories of the American West in the mid 1800s, the problem that I kept running into is like, for one like queer figure that I can confirm existed in that period, in that place, in the past, I would find like one newspaper article that was all about misgendering them after their death, basically. And that's like the sum total of documentation for like an entire human life that you would find. And I kept running into that issue when I was doing the research for this queer Western that I wanted to work on. So one of the things that was a benefit of moving into historical fiction was that I could take all of these partial resources. I could take all of these incomplete historical documents and little tiny pieces of different people's narratives and kind of weave them into a fictional whole. So imagine what a more rich and complex version of a person's life might have looked like at that time, which is rooted in the narratives of several different actual historical figures, but isn't a direct story of one of them because I just don't have enough documentation to go off of for most of those people. So there is something, I think, powerful about historical fiction because it allows you to kind of fill in some of the gaps that have been left in the amount of documentation which is still available to us and which has not been lost at this point in time. Historical fiction is a way to kind of, creatively weave things together and come up with a narrative that imagines what a person's life would look like based in historical facts without having to, need to only be telling stories about queer folks from the past who were very well documented. So yeah, there's an interesting relationship between how complete is the historical record and how much is fiction going to be able to help us to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, especially a lot of the figures would be, if they're going to have documentation about them, they're probably going to be wealthy, or they'll be in a crime blotter, right? So it's, I want to also ask about a narrative voice here, because you've all approached your books very differently, your work very differently about narrative voice, and how, Ajuan, for example, you have a wonderful story where you go back in time and sit in on a on a meeting of Black feminists from the 70s, but you as sort of a modern person, and it's it's funny also, which is great. So I wonder if you could talk about narrative voice in that sort of situation, because I think Josh is doing something similar with his book as well.
Yeah, that was, and it was late 70s, early 80s Black queer women in Oakland. And I would not say it. And so in coming up with a narrative voice, I'm doing something that I was careful not to do when I'm speaking now, that I was careful not to do in the actual comic, which is to use today's terminology, because these were not Black queer women, these were Black lesbians. And so it was an interesting thing to read so much of the documentation. I spent some time at the Hormel Center and the archives at San Francisco Public Library, and there was a Black women's lesbian magazine in the 80s and late 70s in Oakland, and then some ephemera associated with the magazine, letters and debates about who belonged and who did not. And from a 21st century perspective, it was shocking. I was in high school and college at the time, and represented, I guess, the new generation that would start saying queer. And so figuring out a way to write those figures in a way that kind of decentered my 21st century perspective, but also located me as someone who didn't necessarily co-sign all that was being said and done, was a really fine line. And I've gone back in and I've edited some of the panels and want to expand that experience. But it is interesting to kind of, part of it is taking ownership of the fact that, queer identities, we look into the past for people who lived as we do, but also in some ways the identities are not backward compatible. And just being respectful of that and understanding, suspending disbelief that in their space at their time, this didn't have the resonance that it would today. It's a fascinating trip, I have to say.
I just wanted to piggyback on that. And in doing my book, there's a lot of flowery language written between our founding fathers and people of that era. It's very romantic, it's very affectionate, but I wouldn't say they're love letters. But it kind of, that's all based off of class and how educated they were and how they're trying to one up each other. And my interpretation of history is based off of my understanding of love and romance and class and where I am now. And so I thought it was only appropriate that I kind of brought myself into the story in some way so that I could show how fallible history is and how it's based off of interpretation. Because this is someone who was by all accounts gay, but the term didn't exist. And so it's hard to label someone who pre-existed our understanding of these concepts.
Yeah, I love how you try to parse that out in the book, where you're like, okay, this is clearly a gay man in the way that we would know it now, but the term didn't exist back then. So you're sort of struggling with that. That struggle is transparent for the reader, where you're showing that you as the author are having a hard time with it. I did a series of posters on San Francisco LGBTQ history from 1955 to 1970 along Market Street, and one of the posters was about the Compton's Cafeteria riots, which were riots where trans women, drag queens, and gender nonconforming people fought back against the police about 3 years before Stonewall. But writing about it, like kind of doing the research into it, a lot of them, those terminologies wouldn't necessarily be, or in Ajuan's language nomenclature, wouldn't necessarily be used back then. And one of the terms that was used commonly was hair fairy. So it was a queer person who, like, probably assigned male at birth, who would then wear long hair, and that was such a distinguishing feature. Whereas now I think, someone assigned male at birth to wear long hair is not such a big deal. So that wouldn't be sort of a defining terminology. It's just, but how do you get your head around it? Do I have them call each other hair fairies in this piece? And then how do I explain that to a modern audience? Yeah, I mean, Eric, did you run into this even with like going back to Barney Frank's time? And because even within that, I mean, a lot of changes have happened in terms of nomenclature since then.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I mean, Barney's life spanned, such different eras, from the conformity of the 50s, at least where he was, not where he was in his own life. I mean, other places, queer life was flowering, but not in his head. And so, there was sort of a, I'm not really answering your question. I wasn't troubled by nomenclature, maybe because I also am familiar with most of the decades of his life. So I can bridge those gaps.
Let me actually get at this question in another way, to go back to this idea of narrative voice. You knew Barney, you worked with him, you worked for him. So did you ever think about putting yourself as a character in the book in the same way that Ajuan was talking about, or Josh was?
I really didn't. What I did think about, and then I really couldn't get away with, partly because he's alive, and not because, I don't know whether he would have objected or not, because I didn't go ahead and do it. But I love sort of speaking in their voice. I'm confronted with the same thing right now. The next project I'd like to work on, though I don't know whether it's going to happen, and again, it's not really a prop, it just lives behind me in this office, is one of my great heroes was the mayor of Chicago when I was growing up. Harold Washington was the first African-American mayor of Chicago, and just an amazing spirit. Unmarried, always rumored to be gay, but that was as fenced off from his life as, there's almost nothing on it accessible. I imagine that if I go forward with it and research it, that I can turn stuff up. But then it becomes a question in my mind of, am I the person who's allowed to tell that story? That's I would argue yes, because there isn't a more partisan, passionate Chicagoan than me, and I loved Harold Washington and would love to tell his story, but I don't know in this day and age whether I could get away with that. But answering your question, what comes most naturally to me, maybe because of my experience for years and years doing I did a comic strip called The Mostly Unfabulous Social Life of Ethan Green, and I began to embody the main character, even though in fact he wasn't me. I was often the other characters in the strip. Really, I was often the cat in the strip, but still I know how to get the work done by speaking in their voice. And it would have been so easy to do this book that way. But I shied away from it because it, I can't really put my finger on what it was that didn't work, other than it didn't feel quite right, because it was like taking too many liberties with him. I was taking enough by telling his story, and so.
You wanted to keep him centered in the narrative, maybe.
Right. Right, and just to quickly answer your question about whether I was tempted to make myself in a character, I really wasn't. You know, it's such a rich story. You know, a story of um, queer Boston, sort of at the same time that Ajuan is talking about, in, you know, the late '60s, early '70s. The explosion in gay life that happened in Boston, which, you know, gets less play because New York is so spectacular. There was enough to keep me busy without putting myself without, you know.
Fair enough.
At one point, in one panel, I wanted to draw a particularly dopey intern of his, and I gave myself that role. So
I think you're allowed. AC, you in 80 days, you switch narrative voice in this sort, and like you know, it starts with a character, and you see internal thoughts from that character, and then you switch it. I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of how you approach the idea of narrative voice.
Yeah, so there's actually 3 protagonists in 80 days. There's Jay, who's a pilot, and Fix, who's a thief, and Jay's fellow pilot, Sable. And the narrative kind of starts with Jay, and is actually told from the point of view of his like pilot's logbook, which is, you know, usually just for like flight calculations and notes and just observations while flying, because actually those flights were long back then and there wasn't a whole lot to do. So they would you know, talk about how like beautiful the clouds were or whatever. But anyway, it's told from his logbook. And then as the story progresses, that logbook gets passed around to the other characters. You know, and what starts off as like a just pretty lighthearted adventure, you know, very quickly falls under like the looming threat of fascism and a, you know, impending war. And so the narrative sort of shifts to the character that can provide the most perspective on whatever's happening at the time. And through that progression, like the logbook being passed between them, I kind of wanted to like interweave their lives together and sort of like make, just make a whole out of several different characters' lives. Yeah, I mean, what Ajuan said about like sometimes writing historical fiction can be very selfish, that really resonates with me. I feel like it's very indulgent, you know, and maybe I'm being triply indulgent by having 3 characters that would not have happened at this time in history. But yeah, I felt like what I wanted to express about this story and this time period is something that doesn't belong to just one person, that comes from connections between people.
And that's so beautifully constructed in the way that you did that with the logbook and just the shifting of the narrative. But you bring up this, you know, this idea of, I mean, all of you are doing very different things in terms of this kind of project around what is indulgent or not or whatever. Whereas, you know, I think one of the things when you're dealing with pure history around, especially marginalized communities, is that we have to both honor the actual truth of the oppression and the tragedy and the danger that people lived in, and really sort of spell that out sometimes. Like, again, doing some of these, doing the research in some of these posters along Market Street and realizing, like, you know, if 2 men touched each other or 2 women touched each other in certain ways, they would be thrown in jail, and it was happening on a regular basis, right? So if they dance together, you know, and people don't understand that oftentimes from modern perspectives. But at the same time, we have to give agency to queer characters who and honor actual resistance, right? So we have to kind of do both things at the same time. But then also there's the project that you're talking about, AC, but maybe reimagining the past in a more utopian way. And that can also be incredibly healing, incredibly powerful, sort of reimagining the past with a utopian vision. So I guess that wasn't a question, but maybe I could shift to, I think some of this may also be determined by the audience. So Melanie, you're creating a book for a YA audience, right? Like, how did these sorts of issues come up for you vis-a-vis your audience?
Yeah, this was an interesting issue because, first off, I'm writing about the American West at the start of the Civil War, which is not the most violence-free era of America on multiple fronts. But also trying to balance that with writing for a modern readership and a modern readership of young people, and not wanting to constantly be throwing narratives out there that are all trauma when it comes to queer and trans narratives. One of the things that ended up being really interesting for me working on Stage Dreams is in the research phase, particularly when I was looking at the lives of trans folks in the American West during this time period. It challenged a lot of the, hypotheses that I would have had coming into this research, thinking about how much discrimination and violence, etc., these folks would have faced. One of the interesting things is that most of the documentation that I found for trans folks in this time period in the American West, they were living stealth lives. Like, they were not, walking down the streets like, hello, it is I, a transgender person. But a lot of them had, they had families, they had jobs, they had friends, they had romantic partners who presumably knew about their identity and who they were, and they understood these facts. And these were people who had communities around them who were, as far as we can tell, supportive and loving of them. And that was a aspect of this history which felt so counter to the way I think we would expect trans history to go during this time period. We would be looking for those narratives of violence and those narratives of trauma, but I wasn't necessarily finding those quite as often as I thought I would have as a researcher going into this topic. So that ended up kind of working out in a nice way with me exploring this through a YA lens. I decided to take this in the direction of, let's treat these characters, particularly the trans characters in this book, with honoring the fact that a lot of the documentation I found is people who had spouses, people who had loving families, loving partners, jobs, communities, friends, etc., and were able to live relatively normal lives throughout this time period. So exploring that ended up being, I think, useful for purposes of YA and not wanting to, dive into another, narrative of trauma for the readers, but also trying to do justice to something which was a part of the actual historical record in the research that I was doing, and is something that we just don't hear a lot about. So that was kind of where it came from for me. But I think that every book is going to tackle this in a different way, and there's many different valid ways to interpret how we want to handle balancing stories of queer history and queer joy and queer thriving and positive representation for our audiences, with being honest about pasts of violence and discrimination and things which we know did happen and do still happen to this day. So everyone's going to have a different take on this depending on the project that they're working on.
Eric mentioned about how you have to kind of draw things. And I think about this where, people who are writing historical narratives don't have, if they don't want to do the research to find out what the buttons look like, they don't have to talk about the buttons, right? But if you're going to draw the outfit, you got to draw the buttons. You got to know what the buttons look like. So I'm wondering about how you all dealt with research, especially around the visual aspects of the storytelling.
I'm a writer for my book, and I worked with artist Levi Hastings, and we've collaborated a lot. So we have a good way of compiling reference, but I will say that for this book, we were planning on traveling a lot this past summer, and visiting a lot of historical sites, visiting a lot of museums on the East Coast, because I'm based in Los Angeles and he's in Seattle. We're as far away from the Revolutionary War as you could get. And we weren't able to do that. So and because of everything that's happened the past year. So it required a lot more clever research than I expected, buying a lot of journals online and just really devouring anything we could find. And so for him, trying to match all these costumes and stuff is important, but I'd say more presenting it in an understandable context was more important for us than trying to get the stitching right.
And I mean, and you're also dealing with a time period, and both you and Melanie are dealing with time periods that pre-photography, right? So that presents its own unique challenges.
Oh, lots of illustrations for me. Also, the one fun anecdote I have about visual research for my book, since mine is all about like stagecoach robbing, I discovered that Wells Fargo banks very often have like an actual like historic stagecoach like sitting in the lobby. So a lot of times I would be that weirdo who would wander into the Wells Fargo bank and like lie on the floor like taking reference pictures of weird angles of their historic stagecoach that they had in the lobby. So, you know, sometimes you gotta find the weird historical documents where they lie.
I have run into that sort of thing too, where I'm like, someone from the outside surely thinks that I'm about to rob this place or like do something really, really weird. I'm just taking photo references. Yeah.
A funny thing happened to me with that. Some of the landscape that I think being a graphic novel is essentially you're a filmmaker without a crew. So, but you're doing the same things. You're trying to, recreate. Obviously, everybody's got a very different graphic style, but you're trying to bring the reader into this world, and graphic novelists do that graphically. So, one frustrating thing for me was Barney, when he was very young, he was sort of a very smart kid, and Eleanor Roosevelt helped him get into Harvard. He was a working class kid from Jersey, and I won't tell you the long story, but he wound up as a very young man, because he was an outsider and because of internal Boston Irish Catholic politics. They needed a technocrat to help the young, sort of glamorous Irish Catholic mayor of Boston run the city. And they just found this smart, nerdy kid, and that was Barney. So without telling you why all that happened, much of the beginning of the book is happening in the City Hall, Boston City Hall, 1965, 66, 67. It's, the City Hall is easily documented, the outside of the building, but, I want to know about what the crappy office that they put him in the basement looked like, the guts of the place. I'm not making a larger point here. It's just a funny story. So that frustrated me all along, trying to imagine what these fairly bureaucratic spaces look like and make them interesting. And it was, like Josh said, a lot of this was during COVID. So, I couldn't, dummy up a badge and stroll into Boston City Hall and slip in a broom closet. So I figured it out and did my best. Literally, if I sent the book off on, in December, sometime within the next week, a dear friend of mine who's an archivist at Harvard called me and she said, "Hey, did you hear about this movie, this 4-hour documentary by Frederick Wiseman called City Hall? It's about Boston." and sure enough, Frederick Wiseman is a little side who's a talented documentary filmmaker, has been over 30 years filming, the guts of Boston City Hall.
Yeah.
Every corridor from every angle, every, you know, every interior stairwell. And it, you know, I can't bring myself to watch it.
AC, so how did you find, where did you find the majority of your like 1930s, like, because the outfits and the technology that you're referencing is fabulous. Like, you know, it's, so I'm just wondering where you found all that stuff.
Oh, thank you, Justin. I'm so glad you think so. So I'm, you know, I'm coming at this from a very romanticized and idealizing sort of goal. So yes, I did do historical research. You know, I checked out every, especially for the planes, you know, people know when a plane doesn't look right. So yeah, I checked out a lot of, you know, books about planes from that era. I have like a really great airplane encyclopedia that I referenced all the time. And there are some great air museums in LA actually that I went to and took great pictures of like the cockpits and all the dials and stuff, things like that. But really, for, you know, costuming and things like that, I was looking a lot more at like Hollywood imagery, at you know, 1930s to 50s-ish black and white films, and just, yeah, the super, sometimes extreme, like super fashionable looks. Because, you know, historical reference is important, and I'm using that as a base to like make the world feel real, to make the characters' experiences feel real to the reader. But I'm also, you know, I feel like this is also the business of creating new or different idealized images, like expanding the sense of what we think of as classical or beautiful. So yeah, a mix of things, both historically accurate and not really.
Yeah, and you've given yourself, you know, it's by putting into a sort of parallel universe, your world building is more complex in certain ways, but also gives you more freedom, right? To
Right, it's a little flexible because, you know, it evokes this era that we might have familiar images of, but it allows me to, you know, put people in places that we don't expect them to be.
Yeah. But I will say I just will say that my grand aunt was one of the Whirly Girls. She was the second woman in America to get her helicopter license and the 12th to get her airplane license.
That's sick.
She flew Spitfires in World War II, and she's 101. But if you get those planes wrong, she will hunt you down.
Well, I don't have any Spitfires in it, so
okay.
Maybe she'll hunt me down for that reason.
Sorry, Eric, you were say something?
I just want to, I really like the way AC just put that, like, make the world believable to you. I think once that happens, you're golden, you know, and it takes, I know with my, over the last 3 years, it didn't happen quickly, but at some point it does. You know, it's not necessarily the real Washington, D.C. or a filmed version of Washington, D.C., but you've made it real to yourself and you suddenly start inhabiting it. And I think that's, you know, should be the gift that every artist receives, because it's a good one. And that's
a really important point. That's really important. That, I mean, it should feel authentic historically, but it also has to feel sort of authentic to the author, right? And you, because the author has to inhabit it. Ajuan, you did a whole series of portraits of Black men, and a lot of them kind of span different time periods, and so you had to figure out clothing for people, and that felt authentic to the time period and also to your creative vision. How did you approach that?
I took almost the same approach that I took when I was writing about the Black lesbian community of the 80s. I was really wanting the drawings to be legible to the people I was depicting. And so, of course, there was a lot of accountability when you're writing about people where you're drawing people who are still alive. And so you're like, I would never wear that, you know, when I was doing, you know, contemporary Black men. But even when I was drawing the past, you know, I could look in an old Sears catalog from 1900 and see suits, but I needed references that showed me what Black men were wearing at that time. Similar, but not necessarily. And so I would just say as an aside, when people were, when, these comments have been really interesting and I've thought a lot about it. And when I was doing the 1970s, 80s Black lesbian community, there's a lot of reference. There's a lot of information, a lot of reference photos. And so how to sift those for me became the lens of when Black publications depicted Black queer people, for Black queer people, what did they want to be seen? What did they want to convey? And privileging those images, even as opposed to, say, maybe a mainstream queer magazine at that time, including Black people in a spread, I would actually go for the smaller Black magazine, from Detroit or what have you, or Oakland. How do they draw Black people? Or the photos, the party photos that they would put in for other Black folks. And so that really helped me narrow down the number of references, but also create images that really, really, truly didn't just center Black experiences, but also centered Black vision of themselves and each other.
Melanie, in your story, clothing becomes an important part of the sort of character building and plot of because there's a dressmaker there I feel like it gave you an excuse to draw some fabulous outfits, but also sort of had more deeper thematic meaning as well.
Yeah. I kind of lucked out because I ended up writing this story, and as I was doing the research, I found all sorts of like weird fashion history drama that was happening, and like my story kind of like slotted into this very particular area in American fashion history in a very like accidental but very useful, narratively speaking, way. So there was all sorts of interesting things going on where like, fashions would originate from Europe and then they would travel across the Atlantic to the East Coast of the United States, and then they kind of had to like trickle out across the western half of the country slowly, like at the speed of horses, basically. So you end up in this like really interesting period where there's so much that gets tied into like how recent and how updated your women's fashion in particular is, and what your proximity to the East Coast and to Europe has to say about your, the way that you are communicating this fashion as it's moving very slowly across the American West. And in particular for a story about espionage, automatically, that's one of the hallmarks of like heist plots and spy stories in general, is that like there's going to be incredible costumes, and the costumes are so intentional because it's all about what are you trying to project and what lies are you trying to get people to believe about you as you are, deceiving them in these missions that you're going through. So it was just like, it was a barrel of fun, and it was so much fun getting to like dig into, what does it mean when you're like going out and being the first person in New Mexico territory who's wearing, this like flat fronted dress that doesn't have the like classic 1860s like poof at the front, like, there's like meaning that's instilled in all of these like very minute aspects of fashion and women's clothing in particular, and getting the chance to draw out some of those was just a ton of fun. And if I had a longer book, I could have gone even deeper into this subject, but yeah, so much drama that gets folded into fashion history.
Folded. Good verb. And also, like, you even have that wonderful little detail about how they didn't have clothes hangers yet, so they sort of had to hang them on pegs. Right?
Oh gosh,
yeah.
So cool. Yeah, all sorts of things that like you would never think about until you start digging into the research, and you're like, oh wait, like someone had to invent clothes hangers. Like, what were you doing before that?
Yeah. Josh, your book has these amazing. There's so much sumptuous like costumery that Levi's come up with, and of course it also has this extra element of military, right? So military presentation, military costumery, and even when that's taken off. So you have a great moment where you talk about von Steuben's naked cadet parties. So how did you like? Were you thinking a lot about costumes and how to present them in visual storytelling?
Oh gosh, the big thing I was worried about was that the first half of the book takes place in Prussia, which doesn't exist anymore. And it's in all these little Duchesses, where Dutch and Duchesses live. And so it's all these little like fantasy kingdom. Yeah. It's in all these little fantasy kingdoms that don't have a lot of documentation in English, and trying to find the fashions of that. But Levi has just been loving his research, and he's always sending me beautiful paintings and portraits of these boys. And it's interesting too. It's like we're lucky because von Steuben was of the upper class, and so there's a lot of imagery of him, and we're able to kind of extrapolate from that what his peers dressed like. Although he dressed better than them, of course. He's the most extravagant.
And the wigs, his wigs, and I mean.
Oh my gosh, the wigs. Yeah.
All right, we're this is I love talking to all of you about this, all this stuff. We could go on for another hour, but maybe we should sort of wrap up. If you have any final thoughts, but also maybe where people can find your work, what you might want to be, tell people you're working on next, or where your book is coming out, and all of that. So let's sort of go around and do some of those final bits. Ajuan, you're next to me in the grid, so how about we start with you?
I can do a little show and tell. COVID Chronicles, this is backwards, but it's called COVID Chronicles. Just came out from Graphica Mundi, and it's a collection of comics about COVID-19 and the pandemic. Check that out. You can also find me in Menopause, a Comic Treatment, which is also backwards, but Menopause, a Comic Treatment has gotten, picked up some great press, and I think it's a really interesting, edgy book about a topic about which people rarely speak. And my comic is about looking ahead to what menopause will be like for someone who's non-gender conforming when all the discourses around femininity and the preservation or loss thereof. And then Drawing Power came out about a year or so ago, and it is a collection of women's stories of sexual violence, harassment, and survival. And so do check those out. In 2023, I guess, I'll have a children's book coming out about African-American men and freedom. And the 1001 Black Men book will make its appearance late this summer or early fall. So keep your eyes out for that, please.
Yay. Thank you. All right, Eric, you're next up in my grid.
I want to say 2 seconds on the previous subject, which was costumes didn't give me a trouble. It's a well-documented era, and but one thing that has traditionally given me trouble as an artist is, and it was for many years I drew a comic strip, where the characters were basically static in terms of time, so they didn't age, they didn't change, but my drawing style changed every day. So that gave me trouble. And then it's in the early 2000s, I went to Disney to be a storyboard artist, where staying on model was an eternal nightmare, especially when you were drawing things like Bambi or Tinkerbell, which is two of the things that I worked, two awful sequels I worked on. So one incredibly wonderful aspect about doing a graphic biography is, oh, time is moving. He's getting older, things are changing. I don't have to stay on model at all. He can change in every panel. And I have enjoyed that to the hilt after being scolded by many LA animation production managers for failing to stay on model. In terms of my own work, my book is coming out from Holt in October. It'll be everywhere then, and they held it a little bit in the hopes that I might be able to do some live events, some of which apparently Barney's willing to do. So I'm going to do some of them, maybe one in LA, one in DC, and one in Boston with
San Francisco. Come to San Francisco.
I'd love to go to San Francisco. We're waiting for an invite. And then in my previous life, I was the creator of a comic strip called Ethan Green. I had the mostly Unfabulous Social Life of Ethan Green, for which there are 4 books from St. Martin's that go in and out of print. last I heard, 3 of them were in print again. So, and a great omnibus called The Completely Unfabulous Social Life of Ethan Green from Northwest Press, which came out about 5 years ago, is still around also. And it's great meeting you all, and I look forward to buying all of your books. So.
And I will also say that now you're in this interesting position to have made historical comics, comics that are now historical comics about the 90s that you made in the 90s, yeah. But now can be seen as sort of references for other people making historical work about the 90s. Yeah. Josh, you're next on the grid.
Sure. You can find me on social media at Lost His Keys Man. But the Washington Gay General book should be expected end of 2022, early 2023. And then I'm always posting new stories to the nib.com and anywhere else that will accept me.
And Melanie.
So you can find me online at melaniegillman.com or Twitter at melgillman. This book, Stage Dreams, is available wherever books are sold. It's easy to track down. And currently working on, I'm in that weird situation that cartoonists always get into where it's like, I've got like 3 books that I'm working on right now and none of them have been announced publicly, so I can't even tell you what they are. But you know, watch the skies, and you know, starting in like 2022, 2023, it's gonna be just a massive dump of books by me.
Melanie everywhere. Thank you. And AC.
80 Days comes out this September through Archaea. And you can find me at Blue Lewd Bar. I'll spell it in the chat because it's my username from when I was 15 and it's hard to find. But yeah, I'm that on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon. And yeah, I just want to say thanks, everybody. It was really nice hearing about all of your work, and I love how we're all approaching this intersection so differently. Yeah. I think you're right, Justin. It does feel like a moment, which is so nice to be a part of. So
it's funny to every once in a while you sort of look up and you're like, oh, I'm part of a zeitgeist somehow. I didn't know that was happening. And yeah, and for people who can't see the chat, it's Blue Lewd Bar, BLUELUDEBAR. So yes. Yeah, thank you. And my name is Justin Hall. I'm coming out with a film this summer on the pioneers of queer comics. No Straight Lines, The Rise of Queer Comics, which I'm very excited about. It's going to debut at Tribeca Film Festival and then make its way around. And I'm at Justin Comics on Twitter, at Justin Hall Comics, Instagram, and justinhallawesomecomics.com. So thank you all. But thank you. You're all some of my favorite people making such incredible work. And I agree with AC, like everybody's coming at it from different angles, and it's a thrill. So thank you all. And thank you to West Hollywood Arts Division on the Cities One City One Pride Arts Festival. So thank you all. And I'll see your book soon. All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you all.